Welcome back to Contacts. We are joined today by Chris Martin, National Head Swim Coach of Malaysia. Coach, thanks for dialing in from well overseas.
It's great to be here, Justin. And yeah, time zones are something else, but it's evening for you, morning for me. It'll work out.
Absolutely. So let's dive right in. And if you don't mind, take us through your background in coaching. How did you end up as the National Head Swim Coach of Malaysia? And what was the process for you as your career evolved and the major steps that you saw and got through?
Yeah. Well, Justin, I've been doing this for a long time, 37 years. And is this the case for many swim coaches? I often think that swimming as a sport chooses you as much as you chose it. So I swam in summer league, YMCA's, and in my private high school, and wasn't worldly successful, but it was something that I really enjoyed doing. So after a year and a half of the 9 to 5 after college, I went back and I was an assistant at the Germantown Academy, which is where I went to high school. It had a world level program kind of come up while I was on my watch. So I learned a whole lot there. And then that got me started on the road to coaching.
And from there, when you get there as an assistant at your alma mater, what then is the impetus to start looking not elsewhere per se, but as opportunities choose you? How did that go?
Well, it's quite interesting because it was more the second thing that you said. As the program did better and better, and I was standing there, you know, a lot of people wanted to have that same kind of success, so they were interested in getting me to be there. And I ended up coaching at a petty school where I met your headmaster, which was one of Germantown's rivals, and my career sort of progressed from there. I had big success there, and then I coached at the University of Florida for four years for a full Olympic cycle. And then I moved on and coached in the UK for 15 years, where I was the national head coach of Scotland. I ended up being the development coach for British swimming. And so I always say I coached my first 15 years in the US. I coached my second 15 years in the UK. Then I spent 5 years in Shanghai, China, which was an interesting cultural experience. Maybe I'll get to talk about that later. And that more or less led me to coaching here in Malaysia.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I want to follow up on so many things right now, especially based on the last comment that it was an interesting cultural difference being in Shanghai. But if we go back to Petty and you're the head coach there, or you go to Florida and you mentioned it was a full Olympic cycle, I want to talk about that as well. But at each place, as you're learning a new organization's not the right word, but place where you're coaching different people, what have you realized that even though you have all of this experience, you needed to figure out?
Oh, there was a whole lot. The thing is when you first start out being a coach, I don't know if this is experience for your listeners, but I was fortunate enough that I was in a good program. So I knew what worked. I knew what was successful, but I didn't exactly know why. I wasn't, I had not known enough about exercise physiology, motor learning, things like that. So I'm a pretty big book guy. I read about at least 50 books a year, some of them for fun, some of them for that are informative. And I knew that I had to catch up with, especially at the international level, with exercise physiology and the nuts and bolts of what happens to the human body as it develops.
Forgot to turn that off. We'll edit that out. All right, go.
Yeah, so that was what I pretty much needed to learn as I became a head coach. And the reason for that is because you expand the amount of people you coach. Everyone's different. Right now, I have a really organic approach to things, so I had to learn about that
As
and teach
you,
myself.
yeah, and you mentioned something there that I think is really interesting in regards to everybody is different. Can you extrapolate a little bit based on the comment you made earlier about the cultural differences you faced when you moved to China from the UK and maybe even from the United States to the UK? If you could put your,
Absolutely.
what were some of those things that you can go, this is
Yeah.
very different. This is very different.
Very different. When I first started coaching, it was kind of the upward mobility of the United States and sort of fierce competition in all aspects of life. Kids have a certain amount of confidence and they really want to do whatever it takes to get better. So I rode on that for a while. When I was coaching in the NC2A, money was just coming into the sport and people were starting to compete longer. And I had to change my attitude towards that because I sort of had grown up in just the full-on amateur, be the best just because you want to do that. Mm-hmm. When I moved to the UK, it was a lot different because the one word that I had never even, it wasn't even something I thought about, was the word confidence. And in the UK, people were looking for that. And coaching in America, people were born with that. So I had to kind of reorient my way of instilling that into some of the athletes. And then I'm sure we may talk about this later, but when we talk about coaching in China, I had to reorient my entire thinking to their way of speaking, thinking, their approach to life, which is completely different. But I had some help with that.
Yeah, we're definitely going to get into that later. I want to follow up on one more thing before I go on. You mentioned at Florida you stayed for a full Olympic cycle. And the other day I was interviewing a former, let's call it mentor of mine who's a strength and conditioning guy. And he made the point that we should be training high school athletes on a 4-year cycle like they do for the Olympics. And that way they're growing each year, you're refining, you're adding more volume. But that term that you chose, I'd never heard it before a week ago. And then this is the second time in a week. What did that mean in regards to the time that you spent there? Was it a conscious choice to get through that cycle? Was it, just serendipitous? But what does that cycle mean for those of us that are not Olympians and coaching other things, but could maybe understand how to apply that idea?
Okay, Justin, most swim coaches are aware, if not in the front of their head, in the back of their head, of what we call a quadrennium or full Olympic cycle. We learn long-term athlete development.
Hold on, coach. Hold on. This guy keeps calling me. I don't know how to turn this thing off. I'll edit this out in a second, but let me just text him and say, stop calling.
I'll start again.
And you got that your deal glitched out when you used the word quadrennium, I think. So you have to say it again.
I'll start with that.
Stop calling. I'm on an interview, period.
Period.
Okay. All right. Sorry. Okay. So back to the Olympic cycle. I'll cut all that out.
Okay. Most swim coaches, Justin, are aware of the Olympic quadrennium, either in the front of their mind or the back of their mind. And for example, I only ever change jobs at the beginning of a new quadrennium, almost exclusively. So when I don't want to say higher level, but someone who's in the business I am, we think in terms of quadrenniums. The reason we do that is because we learn the idea of LTAD, long-term athlete development, when we are kind of building athletes. I was taught that at a young age. It's become quite a big thing now. The Canadians are kind of, they're the people that well, the main Russian purveyors of long-term athlete development from the old Soviet Union. They all live there. So they give talks around the world and sort of, they're the repository of knowledge these days for most LTAD projects. But anyway, coaches like myself, we think like that. So it informs our decision-making process.
And how would you say that the idea of LTAD as swim coaches understand it could be implemented in other disciplines?
It is from other disciplines. It's implemented across the board. I'm trying to think of the names. You'll hear of guys like Tudor Bompa and some of there's another Eastern European guy these guys are older now, but when they came over in the late 70s and 80s from the Soviet Union, they sort of brought a whole lot of data on how athletes develop and the processes in which they develop, what you have to work on in terms of energy systems, and in terms of growth and development patterns, and how you have to match the training to that so that you have the best athlete you can possibly have at the end of their sort of development, what they call the development pathway. And it's something that I've lived with and learned from and gone with my whole coaching life.
Got it. No, that makes perfect sense. As you have transitioned from stop to stop and have built your toolbox in regards to what you said earlier, I knew what to do. I knew what worked. I didn't know why. I'm assuming now you have a much better handle on that. But what are some of the things that are, let's call them non-negotiables in your approach, no matter what demographic you're working with? UK, Florida, China. This is what we do because this is what has the greatest imprint on our culture and the development of athletes. What would those things be?
Well, and it's an old story, and I know a lot of people don't like to hear it, but the way the body develops is the aerobic window opens for a certain amount of time, 13 to 16, 11 to 17, between females and males, depending on I mean, it can go plus or minus a year either way. But if you don't develop the capacities when the windows are open, you don't really get another chance. So, and that works from season to season, but it really, really works over the long-term athlete development of an athlete. So we need to make sure that the base and the skill levels are developed when the motor coordination and when the aerobic window is open. Once you put enough stuff in there, it's like building the foundation of a house. Then you can put the techniques, the senior techniques on top of that. Now, when I was, in a university situation, I didn't have to worry about that as much because they all came very well developed. But then when I started to go internationally and started to have to oversee other coaches doing the task, I try to make sure that happens. And I didn't say this before, but I'm one of the 10 tutors for FINA in terms of coach education. So it's something that, which is international swimming body. So it's something that gets, promoted and taught to developing nations and people learning about coaching.
It sounds like what you're describing is the cross-disciplinary idea of, hey, here's the fundamentals you must have before you bother with advanced technique. But in the swim setting, you need to do a lot of cardiovascular anaerobic work during this window, or you're never even going to get to technique that it matters. Do I have that right?
You do. You pretty much do. And it's a little bit challenging because let me say that the YouTube generation, the skill improvement in being able to watch someone else do something is massive. And it's been a great improvement, and it has really helped younger kids advance in the skill level. But in the work level, I try to, make sure that people understand you can take you can advance your learning rate for skill level, but you can't allow that to shortcut your working rate in terms of development. You still have to do what you have to do, or you'll look real cool, but you won't be the top dog when the time comes.
No, for sure. And I think your sport is definitely unique in the amount of time you spend staring at the bottom of a pool before you actually get to compete. So I'm curious in what ways you have developed approaches that have, I'm going to say this, and it's probably wrong, alleviated some of that boredom that comes with a sport where you're doing the same thing all the time.
Perfect question. It's funny because I do have a story that there is this thing, and you may have heard of it, called heart rate variability. And heart rate variability became known to me in the late 1990s when these Russian dudes were trying to sell it to us in the UK. But it was big and it was wieldy, it was unwieldy, and it cost a lot of money. And it was very helpful in cutting out some of the extra training that maybe was overkill. But it was so difficult to get these readings every day, all the time. And I let it go for a long time. And just recently, in this incarnation I'm at, my exercise physiologist says, Chris, you can get this on the phone now. And I'm like, what? And sure enough, my kids come in, they put on what looks like a pulse oximeter connected to their phone, sit there for 3 minutes, and it takes a reading that used to take me 25 minutes every morning to get. And it gives me a real good reading of their ability to train, their fitness level, what their heart rate variability level is. And let me tell you what, I call it the lie detector. It tells me more about them than they do. And it is really, and now that they're involved in the process of evaluating themselves twice a day, that's so easy, it has really helped me personalize training far more than I ever could before. So this is one instance where technology has brought some real utility to some dudes who needed it.
That's really cool because I got the pool right outside my office, and I'm friends with our swim coach and water polo coach, and I can't handle it. I just can't. I need some way to make that thing entertaining for me.
Well, I do have a system that we may talk about later where it's called Triangle Energy Management, and it's where we manage the amounts of each kind of training that we do. But combining that with the HRV measure, that has just changed my life. I really feel like, I'm using their time to the best possible way to develop them and not wasting too much of it.
Yeah, and again, what it sounds like as a basketball coach is realizing, well, I've always practiced for 3 hours. That's what I did. But really, I can get done in 90 minutes if I figure out how to be more efficient. And here's the technology and the tools to do that.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, it definitely has allowed me to, manage the whole thing better. And the kids appreciate it. They appreciate it.
That's great. That's awesome that stuff is coming out. So you've been able to view, observe, be around a lot of other highly successful people on your journey. You mentioned earlier the old ball coach Spurrier when you were at Florida, Charlie Strong, these guys that aren't swim coaches, but that you've been able to watch and observe how they do things. Can you offer maybe a few anecdotes of things you've learned watching people coach that were swim coaches or weren't swim coaches that you've been able to apply?
Yeah, I've been in multi-sport environments at the Scottish Institute of Sport and University of Florida. And with these guys, I learned a lot about motivation. And I also learned, though, a lot about, how do I want to say this? The difference between practice and competition. In sports, you might not even imagine, but In terms of, I've even been around cricket coaches. I've been around rugby coaches. And what I've noticed for them in a lot of things that involve high eye-hand coordination, I noticed that when you have a lot of kind of brain intensity, there needs to be breaks where things will then self-organize. And in my early parts of swimming, I just thought, you rested and competed, but it's more than just resting the body. It's allowing what you've learned to self-organize, and there are cycles between that. And I watched it seemed like with the running backs in Florida, it wasn't just that they had to not get hit for a few days. It was told to me by some good coaches that they saw the holes better if they didn't see them for a little bit. And with the cricket people, it was, they would pick up the ball after not having to pick it up for a day or so. So this got me interested in a lot of neuroscience. I read a lot, and I think a lot about neuroscience these days to try to open up some of the brain pathways and understand what goes on with us when we're under environmental stress.
And it sounds like the takeaway goes back to the traditional idea of periodization, or how do you build intentional rest into training versus, no, I'm just going to go do this every single day till I fall apart. How have you seen that play out?
Periodization, I am almost one to apologize because I said the words LTAD without saying the words periodization, and I should have said it. Periodization is everything in my business. Season to season, week to week, year to year, and over the course of a career, it is everything. But we cannot just, and this is one of the things I teach. The first thing I try to teach when I'm teaching coaches is get out of your own experience and make sure that it's only one part of your toolbox. You learned that this worked, but it isn't the same for everyone. And the second thing is that we can't just copy periodization out of a book or out of what someone else does, write it on a calendar, lay it down, and then repeat it. Periodization has to be an interactive process where you are getting back from your athletes information based on what you put in. So the way I describe it is when you're working with an athlete, you do something happens, and you learn from that. And it's a circle, but it's a circle that you go within the circle, within the circle, within the circle. Then after maybe years of working with an athlete, it comes to almost a very close to a perfect information transfer. So with athletes, I'm drawing a circle within a circle, within a circle, within a circle. The more I learn, the more they do, the more we reflect.
Yeah, and you said perfect circle. It's almost like a self-fulfilling feedback loop based on the experiences that you're having with a coach to bounce things off of. Here's how I'm feeling. Here's what you're saying. How do we find this middle ground and co-design what's best for the sample size of one that's in front of you?
Precisely, Justin. Couldn't have said it better myself.
Thank you for sharing that. So 34 years, I think you said at the beginning, or 37, excuse me. And you get back to Germantown, your first time operating, helping out. You become a head coach your first time, and now you're in Malaysia as the national coach. How has your approach to coaching teams and individuals changed during that time?
There's a fundamental core of me that hasn't changed, but there's a big operational side of me that keeps changing. So in terms of the operation, my thing is you have to understand the culture in which you are coaching. That is critical because you will not, I find it rare when people come into a situation and just try to impose their system on others. And I know it's funny because, I lived in the UK a long time, and They talk about Jurgen Klopp and Mourinho and Pep Guardiola and these guys bringing their systems to these teams. But and I know they are very, very successful. But in kind of hanging around and learning a little bit more, I see that even in soccer and world football, when you coach in Italy versus when you coach in the UK versus when you coach in another country, you have to be aware of the culture that the athletes have, and you have to put your system within that culture. And I have had to do that in all the different places that I have worked. Um, but when, in terms of the part of me that hasn't changed, is I kind of try to be like almost like a health professional, where you have to give people the best advice no matter what. And you have to do what's best for each individual athlete no matter what. Whether, I mean, you have to give them the best advice. You need to 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 do what's best for them. So on one hand, I have that kind of unchanging thing, but on the other hand is I want to learn about them and their culture. And believe me, I've been in some really different cultures.
Yeah, well, I think what I hear, the second piece of that is all I can do is give them the best advice I can. And I have to individualize it for the athlete, because what may work for this person may not work for this person. And then all of that has to fit within the culture of where you're living and coaching. So let's go from there to China, because you said that it was I won't say completely different, but it was a very different culture.
Yeah.
What comes to front of mind of some specific ways in which you had to understand the culture in order to apply your system, and how did that work out?
Wow. First of all, I had an interpreter with me 24/7. He's a great kid. He's still like one of my best friends. And he was really helpful for me to have him there. And thankfully, I had read a book in anticipation of going there called The Geography of Thought by Richard Nisbett, who's a neuroscientist. And he talked about the difference between Mandarin speakers, English speakers, and he did tests on Singapore people who speak both languages. Hmm. And it's a collective culture and a non-phonetic language. And the result of that is that they think very differently than we do, and they speak very differently. So I had to funnel the ideas and the ways of doing things through that. So for example, if you speak to one of the kids, they have this thing where when they speak, the information is not the most important thing. You ask a question, you're looking for one answer. And in a phonetic language, we define objects in space, time, and the actions that those objects take. But in Mandarin, they don't do that. Like, the information is about the fourth most important thing. Who's speaking to whom is important, the relationship between those people. And they want to establish kind of like a rapport. So they want to speak to you 4 different times before they give you the information. Now, as you know, in swimming, we don't have that kind of time. And they used to say to me, Coach, for us, it's like squeezing toothpaste. You have to squeeze the tube before we say something. So I used to tell the interpreter, I'd walk right up because it's time sensitive, and I would say, ask him this or this or this or this, and then squeeze the toothpaste. When you get to the answer, come back to me. And then I'd walk away. And kids would giggle, but after a while, they would eventually do that. And they used to say, we talk differently to you than to everyone else in our family that we work with. But eventually, I sort of got through. Now, if I would have, I've seen other Western coaches, come to China and not be as understanding of their culture and really have a hard time. So yeah, and also the way they describe things, their internal feeling system as translated to English. I had to map that with my knowledge of physiology and figure out what they meant when they said certain things. And that took months, to get that right.
It leaves me wondering, if you were to come back to the United States, and not just for a visit, but intentionally to coach, what aspects of that experience with what you call the collectivist culture and the way in which the Mandarin non-phonetic speakers engage, and knowing that, what aspects of that have you found useful that you would try to bring with you to get the Americans to move the needle a little bit towards more of that?
Well, to be honest, not too much. But there is one thing that I did get from that, which was the American way is, I mean, it's a great thing, and it's responsible for 90 some percent of our success. We're obsessed with time and winning, which is great. But we sometimes miss in our exuberance to win some important physiological factors that could help us win. And the one thing I did get about the Chinese was they could describe some physiological things far better than any Western people, because Western people always equate their feelings with the result, with the time, with what I did. You know, did the shot go in or not? But in the case of swimming, there was a way where they could describe to me what was happening internally in their body, and I could tell what physiological system was being used. And for me, that was super important. Whether they were using the glycolytic system or the high aerobic system, it's very difficult to tell those two things apart. But with an Asian person, I can always tell because of the way they describe it. With an American, so with an American, I can never tell because they're like, 26, that's better than 27, right? And I'm like, well, yeah, but it depends how we're getting there.
Well, it's funny that you say that. I read a book this summer that Annie Duke wrote called Thinking in Bets, and it talks about how we always evaluate decisions based on the outcome when it could have been a completely wrong decision and we just got lucky. And you need to look at the decision-making process, not the outcome. And it sounds like that's what you were able to take away.
Exactly. It's funny because you're really good at this job, and I guess because you've interviewed so many people, but yes, you are taking my woefully paraphrased stories and breaking them down to what I'm actually meaning. So
I love it. It's great. Okay. As you have journeyed, as you have had Olympic athletes under your charge, and as you've taken on now leading the entire nation's swim program, you've had to fall on your face at some point in some of these things you've tried to do. Is there a specific failure that you've been able to point to in your career that's allowed you to grow in a certain way that you always look back on it like, God, that was a really seminal moment for me?
Yes, there's one, and it happened early on, and I've almost never forgiven myself. The athlete, has always said that it's okay. And it was, I needed to get someone to be faster in a certain event. And I went and I asked, which, I mean, I'm always good at asking. I asked probably the most famous American swim coach in the world at the time, and maybe ever, Mark Schubert. And I asked him, how do I close this gap? And he told me. And I didn't believe him. And he gave me the exact thing that I should have done. And it so wouldn't break my early youth mindset that I didn't do it. And that just really showed me how you really have to consider blowing up what you think you know and really consider other people's ideas. It happened early enough that, maybe I only have that one casualty for that. And it wasn't like the casualty. This person went on to swim at Stanford and have a great career and a great life. But I always felt like they could have gone. Really felt like they could have done something if I would have done a better job.
Well, it's a great anecdote because it leads me to my next question, which is based on what you just said. You have to be willing to blow everything up. And I want to know if there's something front of mind or if you have to give it some thought, but what is the thing you've most recently changed your mind on? When back then you got told, here's how you do it. And you were like, nah, that's not right. And now you're like,
Right.
God, I wish I would have listened to it. It was exactly what I needed to do.
Well, it's not super recent, but I'd say about 10 or 15 years ago, I had the last big revolution in my thinking, which was, and this had to do with motor learning, and it was considering how the body actually works. And we don't do that. And the reason we don't do that as much as we should is because remember, I'm old enough that there was no such thing as sports. Well, I can't say there was no such thing as sports science, but the idea of biomechanics was relatively new with Gideon Ariel in the 70s, like that. And people started drawing what we do, which is a three-dimensional movement in a foreign medium, into two-dimensional drawings in books so people could learn about it. And we lost some stuff there. So I tell a story, and I met a guy who had done a lot of research into how the body works and how we cut that off by some of our assumptions about how we move. And when we learn how to walk, we don't teach people how to walk by lifting their leg up and stretching it out. And then basically the body self-organizes and shifts weight from one side to the other. In swimming, we can do many of those things. And just by cueing the athlete to think about what's happening, they can learn a lot better. And that was a big thing for me. And I mean, this sounds a little esoteric, but the way I can describe it is, we used to teach people how to swim freestyle, for example, by extending the arm and pulling like this. And I come up with a story where I said, if you're in a room and there's no windows, no doors, and in the ceiling is a hole and there's a rope and the room catches on fire, how do you get out? And the kid will eventually say, if your life depends on it, you'll climb, I don't know if you can see it, like this, like a monkey. Right. I said, well, why don't we do like we're telling you to do in freestyle, like this? Because the body doesn't work that way. Mm-hmm. You've never seen an orangutan swim with a completely extended arm. Mm-hmm. There's always a little curve in there because that's the natural extension of the body. So learning some of that was a big change for me, biomechanically.
Yeah, no, you're right. We don't think about that. I mean, as a coach myself, it's all right. We've got this arbitrary date on the calendar where we have to play this game and we have to go be ready for the game. And while an Olympic cycle, 4 years, I could probably be really good if I teach them how to move their body better, but I got a game in 3 days. So it's what's the cliche, right? You're stealing from tomorrow to pay for right now.
Exactly. And that is what we have to do is build better human beings, and then they will perform better. Occasionally we get a technological shortcut, and we get nowadays we're getting a lot of neurological understanding on how we function, which is good, but there are still some things you cannot turn a 12-year-old and train them like someone in the NBA or in Olympic swimming.
So I have a question that may be a little bit sensitive, and I'm going to ask it, and you can, tell me to go to hell if you want. But I'm curious what challenges you have faced throughout your career by being a person of color in a space that's primarily not. And has that mattered as you shifted from country to country? What's that been like for you?
Well, I guess perhaps I was fortunate, but I came up in what I call the go-go 80s. So everybody was upwardly mobile. And the thing about swimming is you can make people faster, people sort of don't care. Like, this has positive and negative aspects. But for me, I was lucky. I came from a good program. It didn't seem to matter so much. I mean, I served on the national teams in the United States, and luckily, people wanted to be around and to do better. The country was maybe different then. I'm not exactly sure. Um, uh, but I was fortunate in my first 15 years of coaching, where in terms of athletes, I didn't feel it was an issue. There were a couple of times when I drove through, when I was in the SEC and going to away competitions, and there may have been a moment or two at a restaurant that rubbed me the wrong way. But in terms of the organizations I was involved in, I was treated really well. In the UK, again, it's a very progressive place, and I never felt so much. I never really felt any discrimination, or it's hard to describe. Obviously, people are aware that I'm a person of color, but they seem to be more interested in what's in here.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been fortunate that way. Now, when I went to China, it's really interesting because the difference in what I call, how can I say this? Racism is nothing new on planet Earth. And it is something, and the perception of people, the erroneous perception of people is something that, goes on all on this planet. One of the American issue is the legacy of slavery that complicates people's perceptions, and that we haven't gotten past this to this day. But when I was in China, I used to uproariously laugh because, we did something good, and the mayor of Shanghai said, "Oh, what a great black coach." And I wasn't even sure what that meant, but everyone was in a stitches laughing, including myself, because, and I don't know what he meant by his statement, but what I took from it was he must have had some negative connotation of me being a person of color, not enough for him not to hire me or not to be involved in hiring me. But I guess, when something good happened and he got some extra medals, it will have affected him, I hope, in somewhat of a positive way. I guess I could be upset with the reaction, but it was better, I just kind of try to move forward with my own life. Now that I do tutoring for international swimming, now this has really become an issue because, I give courses in Kenya, South Africa, Egypt. I've given them in places where swimming is underrepresented at the world level, and I hope to inspire people of color to not just to develop athletically, but develop coaching wise. And I guess that's the best I can do.
Yeah, no, that's a great answer. And I appreciate you taking the time to lay that out in the way in which you did. It's eye-opening, and it's for me to sit here and process that. Great way to kind of go through the different ways in which that has been encountered, even now as you're trying to bring more recognition to the sport. It's really helpful.
Yeah.
If you were going to start over today and you could give your younger self advice, I don't know that anyone I've spoken to has said, I wish I did this differently, because it's part of the learning process. But I'm always curious for the coaches that are listening, what are the keys to the test from someone that's as accomplished as you, that if you could go back and give those to your younger self, that it would help you get there quicker?
It was to not judge other coaches and programs so harshly by the results of their success. So I felt like I kind of thought maybe I knew more than I did because people swam faster. And at the other point, there were other people that could have taught me some more things whose people didn't swim as fast.
Mhm.
That's pretty much the one thing. And my goal in making that one change would be to learn quicker. And I did learn fairly quickly. I got somewhere very, very fast. And I was a voracious collector of information from everyone I knew. But there were still some people that I didn't take them seriously enough because I didn't think they were successful enough. Then years later, I reconsidered things they said and thought, wow, a lot of times, and there's a lot of luck in everyone's career, certainly mine, where if you get a lot of talent, you get success, and people think you're smarter than you are. And that's not always the case. And there's a lot of geniuses that the right kids have just never walked through the door.
I would agree with that 1,000%. I told somebody the other day that in my sport, I feel like coaching, because we play 27 games a year, it counts for maybe 4 to 5 wins. And then the rest of it is you either have the horses or you don't. And you can make some tweaks here and there. And that statement is so thoughtful because you're right. Some people are next level Hall of Fame coaches that just have never had the opportunity to have the talent come through. And we often ignore that because they don't have the prestige. It's like NCAA athletics. It's D1 or bust. It's like, I'm going to tell you right now, the most skilled dudes are at the Division III level, and those coaches are next level because they have to figure out how to compete without, the Division I athlete. And so I think it's such a good way to frame that. And thank you for sharing that. As you go forward, as you look at being the best you can where you are and making sure that you're serving the individual that's in front of you, which you made clear earlier, we have to individualize our training. What tricks, tools do you have that you've learned to not set the outcome aside, but to stay focused on the process that you can offer? Because that's the hardest thing, I think, for young coaches is detaching from outcome.
Yeah, I'm pretty good at that now. And it's because I try to say that we have to have ruthless commitment to improvement and an open mindset. I've met Carol Dweck. I brought her to Scotland in 2003 or 4. And I visited her when she was teaching at Stanford. She may still be there. And her ideas about fixed or open mindset have never left me. So I try to tell kids that or athletes, no matter what happens, if we can have some incremental improvement every session, every day, even if 100 other things go wrong, if you get better at one thing, the amalgamation of all that improvement will lead somewhere good in some way. And so I have a lot of kids a lot of athletes that are focused on incremental improvement in something. And by that, it takes away the sting of the outcome every single second. And whenever I start a new gig, it usually takes a while to get people to stop screaming for their times. And then once you do that, I don't even carry a stopwatch. I mean, I always have a stopwatch, but I don't constantly click it like I used to when I was 25.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to bring this thing to a close because as a swim coach, almost like golf, it's a meritocracy. I mean, everything is measured. It's real simple. There's no subjectivity to it. And so they want to know those things, wherein based on what you just said, I have learned that it's, seeds daily, right? I tell our guys 1% better. By the end of the year, we're 365% better. If you can just do that and redefine success at times, because growth's not linear, right? It's like the stock market.
No, it's not. It's organic. It happens in a very different way. And Justin, When I went to Carol Dweck's office, she put up her hands like, get out, get out. I don't deal with swim coaches. You guys are the worst people because you're always worried about that stupid stopwatch. And I laughed and I said, no, 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 I'm not going to be like that. So absolutely, you're absolutely right.
That's awesome. Well, you have the honor of being my first international interview. So I appreciate you taking the time and figuring out how our schedules can match.
Good luck with the season. And yeah, it was a pleasure. And I really appreciate what you guys do. You still, I mean, beard or no, you still seem young enough. When these kids go on and do great things, you know, as adults, it's cool.
No, for sure. And I've said that a couple of times. Watching my guys get married, have kids, do other things has been kind of the highlight of my career at this point, not whether or not we won a game or not. So